A very good evening to all of you. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of Untitled Global University. It's such a pleasure and a privilege for all of us to be here to host my very dear friend and longtime mentor, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. There is so much I want to talk about him, but that's not why we are here. But I also want to say that the reason it's special for me is that when I was a student in this university in the year 1999, Shashi had come over for a big lecture, and I met him as a young student and shared the idea of what was then as simply a dream for me to be part of an effort to build a university in India. And Shashi was one of those few persons in the world who actually encouraged and actually said that this is a worthy idea to pursue. Now, as a student, I'm sure all of you get lots of ideas. I got that idea to build a university, and it could easily be possible that when you don't get any sort of encouragement or whatsoever, you can just abandon those ideas. But I was very fortunate that I met him and he supported that idea. And of course, many years since then, we've had different forms of associations, and since the establishment of the university itself, Shashi has been, Dr. Tharoor has been a huge supporter of everything that we have done in the university. He has given over 16 talks hosted by OPT Global University on campus and outside, and this trip will make it to 20 as well. So we will have Shashi doing so much. And by way of full and complete disclosure, we don't pay him at all. We don't pay him 1 rupee to do all of this, and he has done all of this surely because of his passion, his commitment, his dedication to the cause of institution building and nation building. And we are truly grateful to him on behalf of our Chancellor, Mr. Naveen, but also on behalf of our entire university. I am grateful to him for being here and being the kind of person he is. There are so many other things I want to quickly mention. We are, of course, hosting the 35 students of OPT Global University who are here part of the Harvard General Study Abroad Program on Human Rights Development. And again, it's wonderful to see all of you. And I must say this, that your course director, Steve Marks, and the 2 of the faculty coordinators who are with you, Professor Mercy Deborah and Professor Kriti, all of them have said this is the most amazing batch ever. So once again, congratulations. And of course, I hear them telling this in every batch, so I further investigated why they are saying you are. They've said that you do your readings properly, which is very rare among students. I know that. You have these groups of meetings in the evenings discussing about your readings, which is extremely rare. You can do so many other things in this beautiful city, and of course I saw firsthand this morning the kind of penetrating and intelligent questions that you're asking in the classes itself. So I'm very proud of you. Enjoy this, what I would call the life-changing experience. It's a truly privileged opportunity that each one of you have, and I sincerely hope you'll make the best use of it. I also want to take this very special moment to invite and welcome over 25 plus Mason Fellows of the Harvard Kennedy School. It so happened that they are actually beginning a journey here. They're going to spend a year as a part of the Mason Fellowship, a 1-year program at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this morning we had a meeting with the Harvard Kennedy School dean, and he actually has not yet met them. So he conveyed his best wishes to you, and he will welcome you formally tomorrow, while Shashi and I and all of us are welcoming you today to Boston and Harvard and to US. I also want to personally thank Professor Sheila Jasnoff, who is present here, one of the most distinguished scholars and public intellectuals of our time. We're very fortunate that Sheila has been to our campus and has actually worked closely with some of the faculty members. So thank you very much, Sheila, for, I know you had a travel, and so good to see you here. I also want to welcome and invite all of you who are present here from the community itself. I want to thank Steve for putting together this summer school. This particular school was extremely difficult post-pandemic and numerous issues, including visa. I want to thank my colleague Mohan Kumar, who had umpteen numbers of meetings with the the US ambassador and others present to get your visas. So big thank you to Mohan. Thank you, for your presence. Of course, thank you to Mercy and Kriti. Again, I want to tell you, those 2 individuals are present here. We don't pay them anything extra. They're here because they want to mentor you. And so again, I want to thank them. Leaving their summer vacation, they are here being part of this initiative. So thank you very much, Mercy. And with those words, I want to really welcome the one and only Dr. Shashi Tharoor, whose presence and his eminence, because of the sheer depth of his intellectual power and his personality, has really transcended all kinds of boundaries. And so we are very fortunate. He's here. You know him. He's going to speak on our human rights universal. Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you, Raj. Just trying to get out of this tyranny of messages. Good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to join you all today for this lecture organized by the Digital Harvard Study Abroad Program, a joint initiative of European Global University and Harvard's School of Public Health. My thanks to Professor Stephen Marks, the Francois Xavier Baliou Professor of Health and Human Rights Emeritus at Harvard, and to my good friend, Dr. Rajkumar, the founding Vice Chancellor at European Global University, for inviting me to share my thoughts with you all on the complex question, are human rights universal? And of course, welcome to the Mason Fellows, whom we understand, those of you who made it here have made it here on your first day on campus. So wonderful to see you. It must be said at the very beginning, of course, that this discussion and your broader academic inquiry in the field of human rights is certainly timely. For we are living in an era where the very concept of inalienable rights guaranteed to all human beings has been fundamentally challenged across the world. I'm struck by how we've all gathered here in America just a few weeks after the US Supreme Court's controversial decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, a move that will end the legal right to an abortion in this country for the first time in 50 years. America, long seen in many quarters as an exemplar of democratic traditions and the champion of inalienable rights guaranteed to her people, may now push some women in this country to contribute to the already alarming global estimate of 25 million unsafe abortions a year, according to Amnesty International. That's the number that takes place around the world. Or join the 40% of women of childbearing age who, according to WHO, live in countries with highly restrictive abortion laws or where abortion is banned altogether. But rather than dwell further on that topic, I'm sure it's animated many of your conversations since last month's ruling, I'm also conscious that I stand before you as a member of Parliament from India, a country which has been gripped by systematic assaults on its democratic and constitutional ethos in recent years. Across my country, whether it's in Kashmir, where citizens were placed under a clampdown for over a year, followed by the revocation of the region's special status overnight, accorded under Article 370 of our Constitution, or the incredible hardship faced by working people of the country, especially migrant labor, as a result of an overnight, no-notice nationwide lockdown to curb the COVID pandemic, or in many other states where unspeakable horrors have been perpetrated both by individual citizens and the state alike, usually targeting members of a particular minority, or even in Delhi, whence I've just come, where the government has used its majority in Parliament to regularly pass legislation with grim implications for our constitutional freedoms. Whether any of these things, the fundamental assault on human rights continues to grow every single day, and I'm conscious my country is no exception, especially when the state willfully abdicates its constitutional responsibility to uphold these rights. But these are not trends limited to just America or India alone. Since we're in America and many of us are from India, I use those two examples, the very foundations of democracy have been weakening across the world. And I think there was a pair of Harvard scholars that wrote about the phenomenon of democratic deconsolidation around the world in recent years. We've seen the rise of populist, far-right, and autocratic, if not authoritarian regimes taking over in many countries. In turn, these regimes have either enabled or condoned the resurgence of xenophobic politics, the spread of anti-immigrant sentiments, the accentuation of systemic racism, mounting inequality, the erosion of the autonomy of institutions that can offer a check on their governments, and of course a clampdown on dissent. And all of this has resulted in pretty fundamental challenges to human rights pretty much everywhere across the world. This is precisely why it's all the more important to engage with the concept of human rights in a more serious way, to understand how these were developed and how these have been implemented across the world and within our societies, and where we as concerned citizens can further develop these rights and make sure that they are upheld with rigor. I'm therefore pleased that we are in this gathering today, and I'm hoping with your courses will not just engender a greater appreciation for these values, for the values that these rights offer, but will help bring up new voices and champions for human rights in all our societies. Now, the claim that human rights are universal has, of course, provoked many interesting questions. Is anything, one might say, in our pluricultural, multipolar world truly universal? Does the very concept of universality not presuppose a rather unitary view of the world? Specifically, as some have suggested, isn't human rights an essentially Western concept, ignoring the very different cultural, economic, and political realities of other parts of the world? Can the values of the consumer society be applied to societies which have nothing to consume? Isn't talking about universal rights rather like saying that the rich and the poor both have the same right to fly first class and to sleep under bridges? Don't human rights, as laid out in the international covenants, ignore the traditions, the religions, and the social-cultural patterns of what used to be called the Third World? And at the risk of sounding frivolous, when you stop a man in traditional dress beating his wife or his daughter, are you upholding her human rights or violating his? Now, I raise these questions to make the point that a number of serious objections to the assumption of the universality of human rights have been raised around the world. And I thought it might be worthwhile to briefly dwell on this, because I think people sometimes, particularly in more developed democracies, tend to take these things too much for granted without paying heed, really, to the other side of the argument. There are, I think, 6 overlapping categories of objections. Of course, one can divide them in other ways, but this is my taxonomy, if you will. Very simply, the first category of objection is what I might call the philosophical, which asserts essentially that nothing can be universal, that all rights and values are defined and limited by cultural perceptions. There is no universal culture, therefore there are no universal human rights, goes this argument. In fact, some philosophers have actually objected that the concept of human rights is founded on an anthropocentric, that is, a human-centered view of the world. And they say that human rights are predicated upon an individualistic view of man as an autonomous being whose greatest need is to be free from interference by the state, free to enjoy what one Western writer summed up as the right to private property, the right to freedom of contract, and the right to be left alone, unquote. Such a view, these philosophers say, clashes with the communitarian one propounded by other ideologies and cultures. Society, they argue, is more than the sum of its individual members. It has rights of its own that transcend those of individuals. Now, this flows into the second category of objections, what one might call the cultural objections. In a number of non-Western cultures, individuals are not accorded rights in the same way as they are in the West. It is suggested, for example, that in the Confucian or Vedic traditions, duties are considered more important than rights, while in Africa, it is the community that protects and nurtures the individual. One African writer summed up the African philosophy of existence as, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. Even conflict resolution would not necessarily be based, it suggested, on the assertion and the defense of individual legal rights. So African writers have argued they have a complex structure of communal entitlements and obligations grouped around what might be called 4 R's. Not rights, but respect, restraint, responsibility, and reciprocity. In most African societies, group rights, they argue, had precedence over individual rights, and political decisions were made through group consensus, not through individual assertions. A third category of objections is what one might call the North-South argument. People suggest that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary is just around the corner, was adopted at a time when most third world countries were still under colonial rule, and so that it reflects an ethnocentric bias. And this suggests that the concept of human rights is really a cover for Western interventionism in the affairs of the developing world. That human rights are merely an instrument of Western political neocolonialism. One critic, and I'm afraid I think it was an Indian, wrote of his fear that human rights might turn out to be a Trojan horse, surreptitiously introduced into other civilizations, which will then be obliged to accept those ways of living, thinking, and feeling for which human rights is the proper solution in cases of conflict. Interesting thought and debatable. And that would lead us to the fourth category, what one might call the ethnocentrism argument, which objects essentially to specific rights in the Universal Declaration which are deemed reflective of cultural bias. The right, for instance, to political pluralism. The right to paid vacations, always good for a laugh in the sweatshops of the developing world. And most troublesome of all, the rights of women. At its most earnest, this objection points out that some societies are simply unable to provide all these rights to their citizens, or to all their citizens. At its most angry, this objection is to the promotion of rights, especially those explicitly emerging from Western social values, notably the assertion of equality between the sexes. How can women's rights be universal in the face of widespread divergences of cultural practice, when in many societies, for example, marriage is not seen as a contract between two individuals, but as an alliance between lineages, and when the permissible behavior of womenfolk is central to the society's perception of its honor? Moving on then to the religious argument, the fifth. Human rights, the religious argument runs, can only be acceptable if they're founded on transcendent values symbolized by God and sanctioned by the guardians of the various faiths. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, claims no such heritage, and a draft reference to the Creator was actually consciously left out of the final text. So conflict between the universality of human rights standards and the particularity of religious perspectives is therefore a real concern. Many religions also assert that they are the only true religions. For them to accept a common denominator of human rights, universally valid and applicable, is to admit of the possibility of compromise on the basic tenet of their own exclusive infallibility and completeness. And finally, before we all get very depressed about this catalogue of objections, the development argument. And this argument, I know many of you are very familiar with, the argument that the developing countries cannot afford human rights, since the tasks of nation building, economic development, and the consolidation of the state structure to these ends are still unfinished. Authoritarianism, they argue, is more efficient in promoting development and economic growth. The argument is even a little more subtle than that, because the suspension or limiting of human rights is therefore portrayed as a sacrifice of the few for the benefit of the many. The human rights concept is understood, applied, and argued over only, they say, by a small westernized minority in developing countries. Universality in these circumstances would be the universality of the privileged. Human rights is for the few who have the concerns of Westerners. It does not extend to the lowest rungs of the ladder. Now that's the case for the prosecution, if you like, the indictment of human rights. Now let me respond briefly to each of these points. To take the philosophical objection first, I think it's fair to state that concepts of justice and law, the legitimacy of government, the dignity of the individual, protection from oppressive or arbitrary rule, and participation in the affairs of the society are found in every country on the face of this earth. The challenge of human rights today is to identify the common denominators rather than to throw up one's hands at the impossibility of universalism. In fact, a number of developing countries, notably India, China, Chile, Cuba, Lebanon, Panama, actually did play a very influential and highly active part in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the case of the human rights covenants, which came later, the developing world actually made the decisive contribution. It was a new majority of third world states emerging from colonialism, including countries like Ghana and Nigeria, that broke the logjam, the East-West stalemate that had held up the adoption of the two international human rights covenants for nearly 2 decades. The principles of human rights have been widely adopted, imitated, and ratified by developing countries. The fact that therefore they were devised by less than a third of the states now in existence is really irrelevant. After all, the same is true of the United Nations itself, and no one questions its universality, not even the Swiss. The objections, I think, reflect a false opposition between the primacy of the individual and the paramountcy of society. Many of the civil and political rights protect groups, while many of the social and economic rights protect individuals. More important, the two sets of rights and the two covenants that codify them are sorts of Siamese twins. They're inseparable and interdependent, sustaining and nourishing each other. While conflict between group rights and individual rights is not really inevitable, it would be naive to pretend that conflict would never occur. But while groups may collectively exercise rights, the individuals within them should also be permitted the exercise of their rights within the group, rights which the group may not infringe upon. And I say this because culture is too often cited as a defense against human rights by authoritarian regimes who are cheerfully willing to crush culture domestically when it suits them to do so. Also, the traditional culture that sometimes advanced to justify the non-observance of human rights in practice no longer exists in pure form at the national level in any country. The societies of developing countries have not remained in a pristine pre-Western state. All have been subject to change and distortion by external influence, both as a result of colonialism in many cases and through participation in modern interstate relations. You cannot impose the model of a modern nation state cutting across tribal boundaries and conventions, have your president and your ambassador, the UN, and so on, and then argue that tribal traditions should be applied to judge the human rights conduct of that modern state. Then I would go one step further and say there's nothing sacrosanct about culture anyway. Culture is constantly evolving in any living society, responding to both internal and external stimuli. And there is much in every culture that societies quite naturally outgrow and reject. Am I, as an Indian, obliged to defend in the name of my culture the practice of sati, which was banned over 180 years ago, or obliging widows to immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyres? Or the fact that slavery was acceptable across the world for at least 2,000 years does not make it acceptable to us now? The deep historical roots of anti-Semitism in European culture cannot justify discrimination against Jews today, and so on. So my basic problem with the culture argument is that it subsumes all members of a society under a cultural framework that may in fact be inimical to them. If you can advocate the cultural argument with an escape clause, that is, if it seeks not to coerce the dissenters, but to permit individuals to opt out and to assert their individual rights, then I'd have no problem with it. So those who freely choose to live by and to be treated according to their traditional cultures are welcome to do so, provided others who wish to be free are not oppressed in the name of a culture they prefer to disavow. Take the often contentious issue of the rights of women, especially in more conservative societies. And I raise this because whenever we have this issue of objections to specific rights, allegedly Western, they very frequently involve the issue of the rights of women, and they're usually vociferously argued by men. Let us concede for argument's sake that child marriage, widow inheritance, female circumcision, and the like are not found reprehensible by some societies. But let us also ask the victims of these practices how they feel about them. How many teenage girls who had their genitalia mutilated would have agreed to undergo circumcision if they had the human right to refuse to permit it? For me, the standard is simple. Where coercion exists, rights are violated, and these violations must be condemned whatever the traditional justification. So it's not culture that's the test, it is coercion. On religion, it's my belief that men allow God to be blamed for their own sins, and that human rights, as we understand them, are fully compatible with the secular understanding of all faiths. Every religion seeks to embody certain verities that are applicable to all mankind: justice, truth, mercy, compassion. though the details of their interpretation vary according to the historical and geographical context in which the religion originated. As my late boss, friend, and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan would often remind us, the problem is usually not with the faith, but with the faithful. In any case, freedom is not a value found only in Western faiths. It's highly prized in Buddhism and in different aspects of Hinduism and Islam. And finally, there is this question of the suspension of human rights in the interest of paternalistic development. I think it's obvious that authoritarianism promotes repression, not development. Development is about change, but repression prevents change. In fact, as the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen has pointed out in a number of interesting pieces, there's now a generally agreed upon list of policies that are helpful to economic development: openness to competition, the use of international markets, a high level of literacy and school education, successful land reforms, and public provision of incentives for investment, export, and industrialization. None of these requires authoritarianism. None is compatible with human rights. None is incompatible with human rights. Indeed, it is the availability of political and civil rights which give people the opportunity to draw attention to their needs and to demand action from their governments. In fact, Amartya Sen's work has established, for example, that no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent and democratic country with a relatively free press. That is striking, though there may be cases where authoritarian societies have had success in achieving economic growth. China is everyone's favorite example. But yet you can take an example like Botswana, which is a paragon of democracy in Africa, which has grown faster than most authoritarian states. In any case, when one hears of the unsuitability or inapplicability or ethnocentrism of human rights, what are the unstated assumptions that we are not hearing? What exactly are these human rights that it is so unreasonable to promote? If one picks up the more contentious covenant, the one on civil and political rights, and looks through the list, what can one find that someone in a developing country can easily do without? Not the right to life, I hope. Freedom from torture, the right not to be enslaved, not to be physically assaulted, not to be arbitrarily arrested, imprisoned, executed. No one actually advocates in so many words the abridgment of any of these rights. If I can quote my late boss again, Kofi Annan at a speech at Tehran University many moons ago famously said, and I'll quote, "When have you heard a free voice demand an end to freedom? Where have you heard a slave argue for slavery? When have you heard a victim of torture endorse the ways of the torturer? Where have you heard the tolerant cry out for intolerance?" Unquote. Tolerance and mercy have always and in all cultures been ideals of government rule and human behavior. If we do not unequivocally assert the universality of the rights that oppressive governments abuse, and if we admit that these rights can be diluted and changed, ultimately we risk giving oppressive governments an intellectual justification for the morally indefensible. Objections to the applicability of international human rights standards have all too frequently been voiced by authoritarian rulers and power elites to rationalize their violations of human rights. Violations which serve primarily, if not solely, to sustain them in power. Just as the devil can quote scripture for his purpose, third world communitarianism can be the slogan of a deranged tyrant, trained, as in the case of Pol Pot, at the Sorbonne. The authentic voices of the third world know how to cry out in pain. Let us heed them. At the same time, let us not forget the right to development is also a universal human right. The very concept of development evolved in tune with the concept of human rights. Decolonization and self-determination advance side by side, with a consciousness of the need to improve the standards of living of subject peoples. The idea that human rights could be ensured merely by the state not interfering with individual freedom cannot survive confrontation with a billion hungry, deprived, illiterate, and jobless human beings around the globe, so many of whom are in the Indian subcontinent. Human rights, in one memorable phrase, start with breakfast. For the sake of the deprived, the notion of human rights has to be a positive, active one. Not just protection from the state, but also protection of the state. To permit these human beings to fulfill the basic aspirations of growth and development which are frustrated by poverty and scarce resources. We have to accept that social deprivation and economic exploitation are just as evil as political oppression or racial persecution. This calls for a more profound approach to both human rights and to development. Without development, human rights could not be truly universal, since universality must be predicated upon the most underprivileged in developing countries achieving empowerment. We cannot exclude the poorest of the poor from the universality of the rich. And also, frankly, it's an argument we can turn around ourselves as people from countries such as those represented this evening here. Do some societies have the right to deny human beings the opportunity to fulfill their aspirations for growth and fulfillment legally and in freedom, while other societies organize themselves in such a way as to permit and encourage human beings freely to fulfill the same needs? On what basis can we accept a double standard that states that an Australian's need to develop his own potential is a right, while an Angolan's or an Albanian's is a luxury? But I do want to make the point in saying this that universality does not presuppose uniformity. In asserting the universality of human rights, I do not suggest that our views of human rights transcend all possible philosophical, cultural, or religious differences, or represent a magical aggregation of the world's ethical and philosophical thought systems. Rather, it's enough that they do not fundamentally contradict the ideals and aspirations of any society, and that they reflect our common universal humanity from which no human being must be excluded. It's so easy, after all, for the same set of data, as all economists, I'm sure, know, to be interpreted differently from two different perspectives. Human rights, in other words, and I think I've crossed my half-an-hour barrier, derive from the mere fact of being human. They're not the gift of a particular government or legal code. But the standards being proclaimed internationally can become reality only when applied by countries within their own legal systems. We have to work towards the indigenization of human rights, their assertion within each country's traditions and history, if different approaches are welcome within the established framework. If, in other words, we can encourage eclecticism as part of the consensus and not as a threat to it, then such flexibility can guarantee universality, enrich the intellectual and philosophical debate, and so complement rather than undermine the concept of universal human rights worldwide. Human rights, in other words, can help keep the world safe for diversity. I hope I've given all of you enough food for thought over the course of this lecture, even if you may not necessarily subscribe to some of my arguments in specific detail. I hope that as scholars you will continue to debate and discuss these themes amongst yourselves and your many compatriots from across the world here at Harvard, and that together, through your leadership on this issue, we may once again revive and champion a broader and more inclusive idea of human rights. Thank you very much. It's been really
Sure. All right. Thank you very much, Shashi, for really a comprehensive tour de force. In 30 minutes, you covered so much, and it's quite extraordinary. And the floor is open. Please feel free to raise your questions. And yeah, go ahead. Just introduce yourself a bit, and then. Yeah,
Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I came a bit late.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a challenge for these aging years.
No issue. My name is Muhammad Jamil Yusha. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm a new mid-career Master's in Public Administration candidate. Thank you very much. Quite inspiring, and your profile says a lot. My question is, it's a bit hypothetical, but it could be real. If you were to become the next UN Secretary General,
The next?
UN Secretary General, what is the one thing you will do to ensure that human rights are universal?
No, I mean, it's not the privilege of any particular government to ensure human rights are universal. I think it's incumbent upon all of us. There is understandably a certain resistance when any one country sets itself up as the arbiter of human rights standards worldwide. I think the idea is to encourage a consciousness within each country that these are standards that apply to them, and that if they fall short of them, it's up to them to try and fix that. But to uphold these standards universally is our obligation. So I would not particularly say that whether I was in the US or in India or any other country, that country would suddenly have a God-given right to tell others how to look after their human rights. I think that's a mistake, and in fact it can be counterproductive because it breeds resentments as well. Far better, first of all, to work within your own country to ensure that human rights are upheld, and that through your own behavior you serve as a model for others, so that at least when others fall short, any reproaches you may feel they need to address can't be turned right back at you. But I wouldn't go beyond that at this point, Mohammed.
Could I intervene there, because I think our friend from Nigeria was asking about the United Nations, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I heard United States.
United Nations.
UN Secretary General.
I beg your pardon. I thought you said United States. That's why.
UN Secretary General.
Okay, my apologies. The UN, I see. The UN has a definite mandate because, of course, it is the custodian both of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the two covenants, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. So it does therefore have an obligation that others don't have to point to the specific standards that others are not necessarily maintaining. Thank you. The UN Secretary General has principally an exhortative role. As my quotations from Kofi Annan indicate, some Secretary Generals have taken that more seriously than others. But the idea would be that they can actually go out and with authority point to these things. As a matter of practice, very few Secretary Generals criticize individual countries, but they have an authority and an obligation to uphold general standards. And as I said, for example, quoting those lines from a speech at Tehran University, you can also go to specific countries and remind them of their obligations without actually mentioning them directly or seeming to point fingers at them. And some Secretary General have done that very, very well, Kofi Annan being an outstanding example of that. The UN bodies dealing with human rights are governmental bodies. So that, for example, the UN Human Rights Council, when they discuss, for example, a country report, it's a bunch of governments sitting in judgment on a government, and inevitably politics will come in. The individual UN rapporteurs, of course, have the right to name and shame, and many of them do. And then often governments round on them. And it's sometimes said that the Human Rights High Commissioner, in standing up for her rapporteurs, is very often all alone, that the Secretary General doesn't give her the backing she needs. That's part of the challenge, because the UN Secretary General also has a political role, which obliges him to cooperate with governments. Whereas High Commissioner of Human Rights has both a legal and a moral, if you like, justification for standing up even against member states. And there is a paradox at the heart of that, which a couple of high commissioners have discovered, which is that you will be very often criticizing the very governments that have the power to reappoint you or not. So I think human rights high commissioners are increasingly becoming one-term wonders if they do their job well. And in fact, if any human rights high commissioner is re-elected, it probably means they bit their tongue more often than was good for them. But the Secretary General certainly can speak in general. Sorry, I misheard you. Yes, sir. You really will have to yell. I'm clearly getting deaf.
My name is Ashish. I'm part of the Mason Fellows as well, starting this year. I actually work at the UN on sustainable development. But so I think I have two parts to this question. The first is, why stop at human rights, right? I mean, what about
livestock?
No. Why stop at human rights?
Why stop?
You know, I mean, there's a whole argument for rights of nature, rights of sentient beings, and also human rights in the digital age, the digital frontier. I mean, that's where most of the conversation contentiously is heading. What worries me more than, you know, a random despot somewhere saying, oh, you know, these are alien concepts, we don't adhere to them, is the new language that India, China, and Russia have started speaking. So Akbaruddin famously at the GDA Hall said, India is committed to a balanced view of human rights. And now China and Russia had a statement where it said that we are jointly committed to true democracy. And China has started calling itself a democracy now, whole of process democracy. And in fact, China apologists call it a one-party democracy. The US is a two-party democracy, China is a one-party democracy. So the question is that, you know, either these players have entered into the discourse because they feel they have enough muscle to pull the conversation through the means of the conversation itself in the other direction, or this is just another gimmick kind of a thing. So, you know, I think that's what's a good way to tackle the dilution of the conversation from within, which these countries are now trying to do. We're a true democracy, we're committed to true multilateralism, and we're committed to a balanced view. I think that is the very dangerous Trojan horse, and how to approach that.
Right. Well, I mean, the question of terminology when it comes, don't forget, even North Korea calls itself the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea. So, particularly the word democratic and democracy have been used and misused by many countries for a long time, and very often, in fact, if democratic occurs in the name of a country, you can be pretty sure it isn't. I mean, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, this is part of the challenge. But when you're quite right to say that there are more subtle and sophisticated ways of moving the conversation away by talking about other forms of human rights observance. And I think we have to basically say, fine, so let's hold you up to standards. Are there any provisions of the particular international conventions you've signed that you don't feel apply? Because remember that when a member state signs an international convention, they take on all the obligations of that convention unless they specifically indicate there are exceptions. You are allowed to withdraw from one particular provision. I think the Saudis do not accept the provisions on rights of women, on equal rights of women. Though now they are changing and evolving, and they may well become a much more equal society in terms of gender relations than they used to be. Though arguably, for their progress, you have Afghanistan going the other way. But the fact still is that you can essentially, I think the best way in international affairs to universalize principles like this is to hold countries to the letter of their commitments and to ask them, so what is it that you are, okay, so you're a truer democracy than me, fine, you're a true democracy. Tell us how you differ. What is it that you don't uphold? What rights? And you know, we know with China, for example, what rights are not available. There's a famous episode of the Olympic Games when Beijing was hosting the Olympic Games, and the Western journalists were reporting there was no freedom of expression and freedom of speech in that country. And the Chinese said, no. At the time of the Olympics, we are designating 8 spots outside Beijing where anybody can come and say anything they like against the government. But of course, in order to be allowed to speak at these 8 spots, they have to apply for permission first. And every single person who applied was promptly arrested. It turned out to be the most efficient way of rounding up potential future troublemakers. So announce them, giving them rights that they could not uphold. So I mean, that kind of thing immediately, I think, dilutes their pretensions to be actually upholding the same rights as we understand them elsewhere. And I think that there are other ways in which legal systems within democratic societies can be misused to infringe upon human rights. They can be laws passed democratically by an elected parliament that in their application have a chilling effect on human rights and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and so on. I think it's fair to say that many in India have discovered this in recent years. So the truth is that there are many ways you can do that without going as far as, say, China or Russia may have done, which in their case, they just openly make some things not possible to do. Now, in India, all of these rights exist on paper and in practice, and yet, I'm sorry, you can actually see them being violated by the authorities on the basis of laws on the books that can be applied in this way against selected offenders. So these are challenges that exist. But one of the things that I think you learn fairly early on is that the quest for perfection is a pointless effort, because there is no perfection on this planet. We probably never get there. No one has managed it so far in the many, many lifetimes of all the generations that have gone before us, and I dare say your generation isn't going to do any better than mine. But what you can do is to apply principles. You can apply the lessons we have learned the hard way, and then of course you'll have different lessons to learn when your time comes. But I would worry much less about the points you began with, about the environment and so on. Those are amplifications, I think, rather than dilutions of human rights. Because the human rights concept applies to human beings, by definition. That's what the word means. To say that the environment also needs to be protected, or that the protection of nature is a vital obligation, essentially is not about human rights. It's about more responsible stewardship of the global commons, but it doesn't, in one way or the other, it seems to me, dilute or undermine what we've been talking about. It simply amplifies the notion of the rights and the obligations all of us have to protect certain freedoms around the world, and actually the freedom for future generations to breathe clean air or to drink clean water will require us to take actions today that perhaps we could have done better in taking some decades ago. And that would really be where I would see you on that. Lots of hands up, right?
My name is Nasser Tayyib and I'm from Algeria, or to be more precise, the Algerian Democratic Republic. Your argument cannot be more correct and accurate because we're questioning how democratic the whole country is. My question is, how do you navigate protecting the credibility of human rights when we've seen it being used as a Trojan horse for pure geopolitical conflict, especially in developing countries where these Trojan horses are being used to further destroy the societies or nations?
But calling it as it is, I mean, there's no question, Nasser, and that was a very valid point, because we've seen, for example, the language of intervention, which Kofi Annan in many ways sort of brought into international discourse. The rights to intervene, and the French had earlier this notion of the droit de l'ingérence, which in many ways was resented and resisted by many developing countries. Essentially saying, what gives you the right to intervene in my society? If I have a problem, I should solve it. Help me to solve it, don't come and interfere yourself. But the fact is that is a notion that has been extensively debated since a fairly historic speech that Kofi Annan made back in 96 or 97 on the subject, opened the floodgates, and then the right to intervention was, or rather, beg your pardon, it's not called the right to intervention, it's called the right to protect, responsibility to protect, or R2P. That concept entered international discourse. One of the protections built into that was that no individual country would have the right to declare that it was going to go in and protect human rights in another country. It would be the United Nations, the Security Council, collectively representing the political conscience, if you like, of humanity that could make that decision. But we all know that has not always been respected. The US and Britain marched into Iraq without the consent of the UN Security Council. Russia has marched into Ukraine allegedly in pursuit of Nazis without the consent of the Security Council, and so on and so forth. So you will find that each will use justifications couched in the language of human rights. Denazification is human rights language. But in practice, to pursue nakedly geopolitical ends. And the only answer has to be to call them up, to say that this is simply not what it is, and let's not pretend. And if enough people point this out, then perhaps the justifications will be fraying a bit at the edges and will not be used so well the next time.
All right, next question from women. Yeah, please.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to meet you. So there's a lot of commotion and debate about this, but I would like to take this opportunity and ask you for the final time. Since we are talking about human rights here, so India's abstinence on Russia versus Ukraine issue, since we all know Russia violated a lot of human rights in Ukraine. So India's abstinence on this issue is kind of hypocritical. What do you think about that?
Well, as you may know, since you seem to be Indian, I was an open and public, and indeed the first dissenter from the Indian government policy, both on mass media and on television, and in Parliament itself. I mean, I spoke in the Ukraine debate opposing the government's policies, and my reasoning was both couched in terms of principles, but also in terms of geopolitical realities. If you really want me to go into it, very briefly, I mean, I'll try and summarize. I argued that our first statements at the UN led down a number of standards and principles that we had upheld for the preceding 70 years: inviolability of borders, respect for sovereignty of states, upholding international law, condemning the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes, and so on. Subsequently, India did start articulating those principles while mysteriously not applying them against anybody. So the Russians have come in and marched into a country and done all of these things, and you're saying it's terrible, these principles must not be violated, but you never say that somebody has violated them. That too suggests a slightly mealy-mouthed approach. I have to say that mine is a very unpopular and minority view in India. The vast majority of political opinion is behind the government on this, and not just from the government side. I mean, even many opposition parties tend to be sympathetic to the government. The view being that realism dictates that we need to be keeping on the good side of the Russians. So in Parliament, I did explain why I didn't agree with that either. First of all, because I felt that the Russians have, I mean, the reason we needed to be friendly to the Russians was supposed to be first gratitude for many, many decades of support in the UN Security Council and elsewhere, That, as I pointed out, actually included Ukraine because it was the Soviet Union that was friendly to us, not just Moscow. Second, there was the dependence on Russia for weapons. That has been going down. At peak, we had 85% of our weapons coming from Russia. Today, it's about 45%. But indeed, spare parts for the existing weapons and servicing and so on needed to come from Russia. As I pointed out, however, they have been so weakened by sanctions that they're going to be highly unable, in any case, to either supply new weapons or to service the old ones. They can barely get pieces to match what they need that they're losing in the course of their current war. And the third point is supposed to be economics, that Russia does make oil and gas available to us at reasonable prices. And I accept that that is a legitimate argument, but that doesn't require you to sacrifice your principles. The Europeans are buying far more oil and gas than we are, and they all condemn Russia unanimously. So it seemed to me that none of these arguments really holds good, and I've made this point repeatedly. I also felt that it's not particularly smart of any government to be so overtly on the wrong side of history. However this war ends, it will end with a Russia that's weakened, and in particular a Russia that's far more dependent on India's principal adversary, which is China. And so you're going to find that Russia will be of no particular use to you to counterbalance your biggest threat on your borders from a country that has just killed 20 of your soldiers 2 years ago. So why on earth are you putting your eggs in their basket?
All right, yeah, a few more questions. Please quickly introduce yourself, please.
Hello there, I'm Farah Shroff and I'm a TACME fellow.
And I can't hear a word you're saying. I'm so sorry.
Hello there, I'm Farah Shroff and I'm a TACME fellow at International Health. And it's been
Hello there, Farah.
Hello there. It's such a pleasure to hear you speak. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your thoughts on the ricochet effects of rulings such as the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and both positively and negatively, what you think is going to happen around the world, particularly in countries, say, like Latin America, which are much further ahead than the United States in terms of abortion rights. What kinds of things do you think are going to happen? A chilling effect or a heating effect? What do you think is going to happen?
It's difficult. I'll give short answers, which we can move on, cover as many people as possible. I think it's difficult, frankly, to give you a one-size-fits-all answer. Each country has its own traditions, its own laws and policies on the very same issue. I would say that in those countries where laws are much more permissive, there's a certain sense of astonishment that the US has gone backwards. And you've seen statements, even by prime ministers. For example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, openly said that this was an astonishingly regressive move at a time when women have been progressing around the world and asserting their rights and so on. And I would say that broadly speaking, many countries which are already in a more liberal place on this are highly unlikely to backslide merely because the Americans have. Everyone recognizes that America has an unusual system and is in a particularly interesting moment of the evolution of the Supreme Court. And this is something which I think is unlikely to inspire change elsewhere. In certain societies which were already conservative, it may conceivably shore up the resistance to the kind of progressive change that many were advocating. There have been societies, principally Catholic ones in Latin America and Western Europe, where there were progressive movements saying let's move in the right direction to assert women's rights, and yet when this kind of news comes from the United States, it emboldens and strengthens the hands of those who are resisting those changes. But beyond that, I don't think you're going to see any copycat decision making, because each country's situation is different.
Thank you. Let's have some. Please introduce yourself. Please.
So I'm Samrid. I'm in first year of my law school. So I have a two-part question, real quick. So I hope you're aware of Xinjiang, what's happening with the Uyghurs in the detention centers. It's both violative of UDHR and ICCPR. So is there some sort of mechanism by which the accountability to such obligations can be ensured? And coming to the second part, to make human rights universal, our remedies should be made universal so that the rights can be made universal.
Right. Both very interesting, thought-provoking questions. On the Uyghurs, part of the problem is that you don't have a systematic effort to act against China on this, partially because China is as powerful as it is. Remember, in a body of sovereign states, other states are always going to be conscious of their relationship with the state they're pointing their fingers at. It is striking, for example, that the Uyghurs are being persecuted also, in fact, some would argue principally because of their religious beliefs. They're Muslim. And yet no Muslim country, not even neighbors like Pakistan, have raised their voice against it because they value their relationship with China far more than the fate of a few million Uyghurs. And that's what you're seeing. So in a body of member states, you've got to have states that actually are willing to get together and raise their voice in condemnation, which they don't do because they also know that raising their voice will not actually help the Uyghurs in China. Because who is going to be able to tell the Chinese what to do and to get the Chinese to listen to them? It's not going to work. So they don't bother, they don't want to burn their bridges with China. That's the real problem. On the second point of universal remedies, I mean, the UN is supposed to be the repository, both of universal rights and of universal remedies. The problem with remedies is that we don't really have, quote unquote, a world government. What we've got is a collection of sovereign national governments sitting together and agreeing on common steps. So even if, for example, a UN human rights body writes and publishes a report that's condemnatory of a particular state and recommends a remedy, who's going to impose that? Say tomorrow the Israelis in the occupied territories. What's going to happen? Who's going to tell Israel that they can't do something and they have to do something else? And who's going to enforce it? Nobody. Therefore, that is a quest that actually presupposes a supranational authority that in fact doesn't exist in the world.
Yeah, please, next.
Right, so my name is Sankar Varma and I'm also a first law student in Jindal. So my question is a bit restricted to India. As you said that we have seen an increased number of human rights violations that is taking place in India by the authorities. But my question is, what form of remedial mechanisms can we provide? Because in the last few decades, we have seen that the judiciary is taking a prolonged number of time with a huge number of backlog of cases which are present, and it's taking a lot of time to achieve justice if justice is achieved in the first place. So, as citizens of the country, what other form of remedial mechanisms can we provide in cases of human rights violations?
The only answer lies in the judiciary, I'm afraid, because when a legal right is violated, it can only be enforced in the courts. That's what the system is. There is obviously the ultimate sanction of turning out a government that's abusing these rights. But as you can see, the Indian voter doesn't seem particularly inclined to head in that direction. So we will have to rely on the courts. And the courts have been not totally, as you said, giving in. In some cases they have given in, in other cases they're still up for it. So difficult to give, again, a generalization there, except to say that it is in our system and in most democratic systems, legal rights can only be upheld and therefore enforced by the courts, by the judiciary. We have to leave it to them.
So we have around 8 minutes. Just want to alert you, please.
Sir, hello. My name is Nathan. I'm in the final year of law college. So my question is more on the philosophical side, that more regarding the philosophical objection. So while addressing the question of human rights, we come to ethics and morality at times, and of what being right and the wrong. And while exploring this, we explored, are these right and wrong universal and standard, or are we told that these are universal and standard, constructed over time, historically, with social reforms, political movements, and economical reforms, right? So at this juncture, where we do not know how to navigate this moral compass, or let's say when we do not know whether we can locate the coercion that you talk about, at that juncture, at such derangement, how would you define the denominators that you talk about?
Well, I did try to address that in my remarks. I mean, I said, essentially you've got to look at what are the specific rights that a system would seek to deny to people, anathemize them, and challenge them. Similarly, what are the, when individuals say that there's something they don't want to do and they're forced to do it because they have no choice, what are those and are they not violations? But when you say you, who is the you? If we are outside observers studying all this, we can certainly draw these conclusions, I think, without too much difficulty. If you're caught up within a particular society, and you have to fight that battle within the society, it becomes a different challenge. And there I would say that it depends entirely on the person whose rights are violated to actually manage to amass enough support to make sure her rights and the rights of others in the future are not violated further. The issue with this is that every society is not the same. And in some it will be possible for you to organize in defense of your rights, and some it may not be so possible, etc. But for the outside observer making moral or philosophical judgments, I would submit it's not that difficult.
Great. All right, let's move there, please.
Hi.
Introduce yourself and then.
Hi, Dr. Wu. Thank you very much. My name is Nishan. I'm a candidate here at Harvard doing an MPA. My question is, India likes to talk about itself as being the world's largest democracy, but my question is, what are the standards and principles that India stands for in relation to human rights, given the backsliding and assault that is already taking place in the country? So, in other words, what is India if not a democracy? And what does India's democracy stand for?
You can't give a simple answer to that. It's too vast. But I think just one example. I mean, just last week, the UN Human Rights Commission voted on a resolution about gay rights, gay, lesbian, so on and so forth. India abstained. But the Indian Supreme Court has determined that it's entirely legal to be gay. So, which is India? Are you talking about the Indian legal and constitutional system, which does not anymore permit prosecution of gays? Are you talking about the Indian bureaucracy and government, which has chosen to abstain on the appointment of a UN rapporteur on gay rights? India is both. India is all. So if you're gay in India, the Supreme Court is with you. And if you're gay in a foreign country, the Indian government is not particularly keen on protecting your rights. Now, go figure. You know, it's too complicated a question. I mean, the question you asked requires a very detailed sort of dissertation level response, and I don't believe we have time for it.
There's a question there.
And there's a young lady here who's had a hand up for a long time. Right?
Okay, all right. Yeah, please go ahead.
Dr. Tharoor,
Introduce.
My name is Kartika Sanjay. I'm going to my 4th year in law school, and it's been an absolute pleasure to hear you speak again. I've seen you in campus before, and it has been wonderful. And my question was regarding how the Indian government stance on women tends to change from, saying that, yeah, we are here for women's rights, and then quickly voting, presenting very strong objections to, say, in the marital rape case. And I just wanted to hear what your opinion would be to actually, help our country reach a state of equality in any field, to say. Yeah.
I don't think I have a glib answer or pat formula on that. It's a work. It's a work in progress. It requires continuous struggle and effort, and I think it's incumbent on all of us as citizens of a democracy to ensure the government takes its own profession seriously, and that we hold them accountable for their upholding the values and standards we believe as citizens. After all, the democracy is made up of individual citizens' choices. We should make ourselves heard as citizens. Beyond that, difficult to give you an answer.
Please.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My name is Palak. I'm in my final year of law school. And I wanted to ask that in the last decade, we witnessed a series of ultra-conservative governments all over the globe, in the US, in UK, even in India, in Canada and other nations. So considering that this coincides with the rise of technology and surveillance, how do you think this would affect human rights, and especially when it comes to the right to privacy, the right to internet shutdowns, and arrests that are based on social media and so on and so forth? Because this is a new era that we're entering.
I agree. This is a battle we have to fight in each society. In the case of India, we're lucky that the Supreme Court did uphold the right to privacy. So that can become a new yardstick within which new rights can be enforced and new cases can be fought. But the government, as you know, has been dawdling over passing a Data Protection Act. So technology can still be collected by the government, but there's no act regulating it. Technology can still collect your data, snoop into your life, your spending patterns, anything, your travel, whatever. And so far, there's no absolute protection there. The day it's misused, you can go to court and claim your rights to privacy were violated. But until then, the government will be violating your rights to privacy every day, and you wouldn't know it. So there are some real issues and concerns. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is that the draft bill, which has not yet come before Parliament, but what's been circulated, actually has the government free to make all sorts of decisions, exempt themselves from all the regulations provided in the draft Data Protection Act. And at the same time, if you appeal, it's only a bunch of government officials who will be ruling on the actions of the government, which is, to my mind, a complete nonsense. I mean, if you have an appeals body, it must be surely composed of independent members who are not affiliated with the government, so you can have an objective view of whether a government decision to sequester your data or release your data or use your data was appropriate or not. All of that we haven't got to. So it's a battle that's got to be fought. The Europeans are well advanced with their GDPR and so on. I think the US is not doing too badly, though many issues are still being fought out of the courts. India, we are worryingly behind, and I do worry about where we're heading in this direction.
Last three questions. Three questions. Oh gosh. Okay.
4 hands up.
I know. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. So nice to meet you. Last week.
Introduce.
Sorry, my name is Aditya. I'm entering my final year in International Affairs. Last week we had a speaker from World Bank. She's also a practicing lawyer, and she suggested that there exists a language barrier within the discourse of human rights and development, and that lawyers speak a language that is completely different from language that is spoken by human rights activists or developmental economists. Now, considering that we need all hands on deck to reinforce human rights and development, how do we reduce this gap in language?
That's an insurmountable challenge. How do you do that? Because fact is, you already have language issues when it comes to which language you're speaking, literally, and how those are translated into other languages. And very basic concepts can mean different things once you go through the translation route. Then when she says language, I'm assuming she means terminology. And terminology again becomes a complicated area. I wouldn't even pretend to give you a global answer to that. I think this is probably a valid point she's made, but the question is, there are commonly, for example, there are so many treatises on these various covenants and on the Universal Declaration, explaining what each thing is supposed to mean. And there have been examples of cases over the years where the Universal Declaration, as I said, is now 3/4 of a century old. It's, I think, difficult to take refuge entirely behind, terminology in saying that, oh, well, we didn't understand the same thing about this particular phrase as you did. I think ultimately you can find some common ground. In any case, the search for common ground is part of my argument. We need to keep doing that.
All right, please go ahead.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My name is Rahul. I'm entering my 3rd year of law school. My question was, so in one of our lectures today, one of the professors had actually said that the inclusion of new rights, recognizing new communities, would actually lead to a failure of human rights obligations, considering human rights are universal.
So you have to repeat that last sentence. The recognition of human rights in communities would lead to a failure of human rights obligations.
Inclusion of new rights, recognizing new communities, would actually lead to a failure of human rights obligations, considering that human rights are considered to be universal.
Yeah.
My question is, how much would you agree with that statement? And if you do, don't you think it would further dilute the definition of what human rights are?
So, by full disclosure, Professor Hurst Hannam, Tufts University, Fletcher School, he
made that argument. Well, look, I've argued, for example, in my book, The Battle of Belonging, which is available in this country under the title The Struggle for India's Soul, that India kind of found the answer to that by actually recognizing both group rights and individual rights. And that was the magic of what Ambedkar tried to take the country strongly away from group rights to a sense of individual agency, individual citizen of what mattered in the Indian Constitution. But there are many collective rights. For example, personal law belongs to a community, not to an individual, and so on. So I think what I said in my speech was you can certainly have both group rights and individual rights, provided the individual is able and permitted to subtract herself or himself from the community rights. So in other words, let's say in India, for example, Muslims can marry under Muslim personal law. But a Muslim woman or man can choose not to marry under Muslim personal law, but to marry under the Civil Code, under the Special Marriages Act. Now, that, to my mind, is a good example of what should work. In other words, the group rights exist. Everybody who wants to subscribe to the Muslim personal law does so, and they have the right to do so. And they follow their own practices, rituals, and with it come certain rights for marriage, inheritance, divorce. All of that is governed by Muslim personal law. But if somebody says, I don't want to do that, I want to marry under the Special Marriages Act and have my civil rights protected by civil law, they should have the right to do so. And that's all I'm saying. Culture isn't the issue, group rights aren't the issue, it's the question of whether the individual is free to dissent from that particular obligation. And if the individual is free to do so, then both group rights and individual rights can exist.
Right, please. Last two questions.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My name is Vishesh Verma, and I'm a first year in the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. My question is to you, how can we improve our global systems in holding countries accountable for breaching human rights violations? And what challenges do you think we might face in terms of upholding and improving the systems, and also
who's the we?
Sorry,
who's the we? The world?
The world, and like institutions like the UN, the high courts, and all of these ruling and I'd say monitoring parties. And as you said, that countries like Israel, China, who are already becoming superpowers, it's a lot harder for us to hold them accountable. So, to what extent do you think that a country becoming powerful can give them somewhat of a leeway in terms of being, to be shown guilty of breaching?
Yeah, in terms of enforcement mechanisms, I'm afraid all we've got is the state system. The state system is run by governments, member states of the United Nations, and it's their collective decisions, which are all made with political considerations in mind, that will constitute your enforcement mechanism. So I'm afraid you're not getting joy there. In other words, if, as I said earlier about China, governments are not willing to particularly take action against, even complain against an offender, that offender will continue getting away with what they're doing. But frankly, even if member states complain, what could you do about a state as powerful as China? What can you do about Russia? Right now, a majority of member states in the General Assembly have voted against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Has it made the slightest difference to Russia? So where a state is powerful, the truth is that there are limitations in the interstate system. But individual citizens, individual public opinion, mass media, all of these things also matter. And increasingly, I would argue, in a world of social media and so on, that public opinion is a very, very powerful force. So we haven't fully got hold of and got fully understood. And I think it may be entirely possible that even what governments aren't prepared to do, public opinion will in effect create a certain judgment against offending states. At least that's what I hope, but who knows?
Last question.
Good afternoon, sir.
No.
My name is Dev Karthik, and I'm going into the third year of law school.
Mm-hmm.
In your prosecution, you had mentioned cultural objection and the philosophical objections, where you said that some societies view the society as greater than the sum of individuals, and in the cultural objection, you said that the Vedic and the Confucian schools view duties as more paramount to rights and more paramount to rights, and it is I am because we are, and we are because I am. And in these societies, group rights are given more preference to individual rights. In India, Prashant Kishore has always had the view that the public is the wisest and their mandate must always be respected. The present government, irrespective of their track record, keeps winning the mandate, keeps winning what is known as, in his words, the wise mandate, and seems to always come back stronger. They are increasing their influence in southern India, as seen in the Hyderabad municipal elections and the Tamil Nadu Panchayat elections. Based on this, would you think that in the Indian context, cultural rights of humans is given more importance than the individual human rights? And what would be your response to this as an opposition leader? How would you counter such a mandate, knowing that you are in the opposition?
Counter a mandate. You can only try and persuade those who give the mandate that they should give us the mandate instead, which we haven't been very effective in persuading them to do. I mean, the truth is that we are now heading into a slightly paradoxical situation, but it's not unknown in other countries, including some West European ones, where the democratic vote gives you a result that is inimical to some of the most cherished principles and values of democracy and human rights. But I think, this is what people want, would be the argument, right? And the American people voted for Trump, despite us saying throw all the Mexicans out and all that sort of stuff. Throw all the Muslims out, throw all the Mexicans out. He had a whole series of one-liners which apparently won in the majority. And the question you have to ask yourself is, in a democracy, are you not obliged to play by the rules? Yes, you are. And if that's what the voters get, then they can pass the laws that they believe the voters want them to pass. And we're seeing that happening increasingly in India. All we can do, I think, in the democratic system is to present a vision of the alternative case and urge, you can sit down if you like, Dave, and rest your nose. And you could essentially find that there is one day a recognition that some of these things have gone wrong. And it's often pointed out that Hitler had a democratic mandate back in 1933. And that ultimately the logic of what he was trying to do went so far that eventually there was a great revulsion against it that eventually resulted in his own destruction. But if a government doesn't create the conditions for its own destruction, goes on this way, that society changes in a certain way. I think you can argue you're seeing that now in Hungary, under Orban. You're seeing that possibly to a great extent in Turkey, under Erdogan, where within a democratic system of free and fair elections and so on, you have people elected by a popular mandate who are hollowing out all the institutions of democracy and human rights and getting away with it because people are supporting them. Now, that may well happen in India too, and that's one of the things I've been warning about in my writings and speeches. Sorry not to be giving you more cause for optimism than that. But we will continue fighting the good fight as long as we can, and as long as enough voters are around to help us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for not only the fabulous lecture, but this amazing freewheeling discussion. It's actually, these days, it's pretty rare for us to have such conversations in this manner, so I'm really grateful to you for taking all the questions. I also want to mention that as independent individuals, young people in particular, it's important for us to be conscious of the fact that we have a duty to protect and preserve the rights that we're talking about, regardless of political and other forms of objectives that individual governments might have. And so there is a transcendental nature of rights that we need to be conscious of. And actually this, it is not at all unusual for many of us to assume that democratic mandates can actually lead to individual governments taking decisions which may actually be inimical to rights themselves. This country is a very good example, and I actually believe it's not just the courts. For a very long time, courts, even the Supreme Court in this country, talked about separate but equal, and it took Brown v. Board of Education for this country to recognize that separate but equal is not good enough. And that led to a huge evolution of the race relations in this country, and we can look at parallels. So in many ways, while we should focus on building institutions, strengthening institutions, but what Shashi mentioned towards the end of his talk is that what is absolutely critical is we need to invest in building public opinion, we need to invest in developing strong civil society voices, we need to invest in many more individuals speaking truth to power, regardless of the political mandates and even electoral democracies functioning. In fact, there is a very real risk that we have seen, and I think one of our students just mentioned about the fact that there are many elected governments that are increasingly acting in a rather undemocratic, dictatorial manner, and that is probably the biggest risk for democracy itself. And the larger context of this lecture, what Shashi had mentioned about all human rights being universal, is actually empowering the individuals in the fight in protecting and preserving human rights. So thank you very much, Shashi, for that.
Well, for those particularly with an interest in India, I'm speaking day after tomorrow again at Harvard on sort of law and the idea of India, and some of these issues
are raised
in more detail.
This is a moving crowd with you, so they will all.
Can you talk about Sri Lanka a little bit before we end?
Sri Lanka.
I was elected by a group back here. It wasn't my question.
I know. Well, we are running late, so we will start. He'll be around for some more time, so you can chat with him on that. I'm going to invite Professor Gulmunder to say a few words, followed by Professor Stephen Marks, who will deliver the concluding remarks. We want to wind up in 5 minutes so that we can have a small tea reception, which is waiting for all of you. Please, Professor Gulmunder. Professor Gulmunder is a professor at the Digital Global Law School. He was Iceland's ambassador to India. He was judge of the Law of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg, and he was also dean of the Faculty of Law at the United Nations University in Costa Rica. He was one of the founding members of the Law of the Sea treaty-making effort. Please.
Well, just to thank you, Shashi. We're all very lucky to hear you. And if I may say so, as a foreigner living in India, I think India is lucky to have you in the parliament. I just want to thank you particularly for mentioning the role of the judiciary, and I'll be developing that tomorrow to the Jindal students, Jindal Harvard students. But for those of you who won't be there, I want to point out that I have great optimism about the work of the International Criminal Court, which I think went against the grain, in the sense of the commitment that you mentioned. That is in fact, a miracle that was achieved.
It's hard to hear you.
I'm saying
That the International Criminal Court was a miracle that was achieved because it actually can sit in judgment on governments.
Thank you, Professor Gulbunda. Steve.
Could use the mic.
I don't always need the mic because I do project my voice, don't I? So I'm given the distinct privilege of wrapping this up, but I do want to say something, and I'll be saying it from the bottom of my heart. You mentioned on 2 occasions that we're approaching the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Believe it or not, and you can probably believe it, for the 20th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, do the arithmetic, you'll figure it out. 20th anniversary, I started my first job after my graduate studies. And that job was working for an institute created with the Nobel Peace Prize money for the man who was the principal author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, President René Cassin. And René Cassin, in the drafting process of the UDHR, is normally regarded, and he's told me this himself, as responsible for the word universal in the UDHR, because they genuinely felt, and he captured that in proposing and getting acceptance for the word universal, that they were not just dealing what the agenda said, International Bill of Rights, but that they were speaking on behalf of people globally, not states, but people, and hence the term universal in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was a great privilege of me to start my career working for President Cassin. And I still remember, and I can see the gleam in his eyes when he looked at me. He didn't grab me by the collar, but he looked at me and he said, Mr. Marks, I want you to go forward and ensure that human rights is taught in all the great universities that you have any opportunity to interact with. So, in a sense, that was a moment for me that, as you can perhaps guess, kind of did like the path that I've tried to stay on all these years. But I would say that this talk today is a moment for me like that moment. Hearing one of the most articulate voices on international affairs and international relations address the question, are human rights universal? It brought me back to that moment when René Cassin gave me a mandate. And I believe that having the privilege under the authority of the esteemed Vice Chancellor of this university to bring together for the 5th time students in this program on human rights and development, and having our guests from the Kennedy School here, and having this occasion for Shashi Tharoor to address the issue as he did today, constitutes for me a moment that I would place right on the same category with my encounter with René Cassin on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the UDHR. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now we have a little reception upstairs, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And thanks again. Enjoy it. Thank you so much for coming to everybody.